So, ladies and gentlemen, we're now proceeding to our next session. We're about half an hour behind, but we'll just carry on as if it were earlier. After all, what is food? It gives me great pleasure to present our first speaker, Egbert Bakker, who is very famous and has combined in an extremely original way linguistic theory, literary theory, and recently food. And without more ado, I hand over to him.
Is this on? Is this mic on? Yeah. The title that you see on the handout is a little different from what is in the program. That's because I gave that title when I did not have a paper yet. I hope I do now. So it's about epigram as a model for allergy. Makers of poems tend to compare their compositions favorably with the work of sculptors and with other monumental creators. Poems can travel, whereas sculptures are stationary. Poems can go in search of their audiences, whereas monuments have to wait immobile until someone happens upon them or comes to them. Pindar's statement in number 1, "I am no sculptor," is probably the best known expression of this principle. Poets also dispute the claim that monuments and their inscriptions are imperishable and everlasting, whether or not they supplant this with the claim as to the superior durability of their own poetic compositions. Simonides' critique of Cleobulus of Lindos, to whom the famous Midas epigram, to which we will turn later, was ascribed, is typical in this regard. Where we have number 2, "Who in his right mind could praise Cleobulus who dwells in Lindos? This is the man who placed the force of the Stele against ever-flowing rivers, the recurrence of the spring flowers, the gleam of the sun and of the golden moon, as well as the whirls of the sea. Everything is less than the gods. A stone, even the hands of man can shatter to pieces. This is a fool's thought." And yet, in spite of this, the monumentality of the inscribed epigram, as I will argue, is the benchmark by which written texts are measured and the standard to which they aspire. The archaic epigram is more than just a model for epigram as a literary genre in Hellenistic times and beyond. It sets the standard for writing itself, even for the very notion of authorship, as I will suggest. I will explore this idea on the basis of the awareness of epigram that I think I can see in the elegiac corpus of the Theognidia. I start with emphasizing the by now well understood fact that reading and writing in early archaic contexts involves voice, the physical voice of both the reader and the writer. The idea that writing cannot exist without voice is evident in the fact that the writing on the earliest inscribed objects is construed as the voice of that object. In number 3 and 4, you see well-known and simple examples of this phenomenon, the one sepulchral and the other a dedicatory text. Number 3, "I am the Stele of Xenwares, the son of Meixis, standing on his tomb." Or, "I am Terpon, the man of pleasure, servant of the goddess, holy Aphrodite, and to those who placed me here, may Kypris fully return the favor." And then there is the Midas epigram itself that also belongs to this type. I read a translation which was not included. "I am a maiden of bronze, and I stand on Midas's grave. As long as water flows and tall trees bloom, standing right here on this much-lamented tomb, I shall report to all those who pass by that Midas lies buried here." Midas otiteide te taptai. The exact nature of this conception has been much discussed. The speech of these oggetti parlanti has been considered in almost animalist terms, as if they are magically endowed with speech, or thought to be so by their users and writers. A conception that has been replaced by Svenbro in his Phrasicleia book with an idea of here-ness. And the monuments expressly articulated egocentricity. A presence, a here-ness of the text that goes at the expense of the writer, who, as Svenbro calls it effaces himself in the act of writing. We will get to the writer in a minute, but first I would like to address this idea of egocentricity, which I think is problematic. The monument or votive object is not so much focused on itself, I would suggest, as on its function, which is commemorating a specific deceased person or being a votive offering to a particular god. Moreover, it seems fair to say that the monument is not autistically self-oriented and monologic, but instead quite dialogic and intensely reader-oriented. The self-presentation is the answer to a projected question on the part of prospective readers. What are you? Whose are you? For whom are you? Or even, who are you? The funeral monument or votive object wants to share its identity with whoever comes its way or happens upon it. More complex inscriptions can self-consciously expand on this principle, turning the implicit dialogue into an explicit question and its answer. Again, two well-known and straightforward examples in number 6. You see that the object explains, so to speak, the situation. It will respond to each and everyone who interrogates it, articulating the reader's question as an indirect question. To all people, I give the same response. It says, whoever it is who asks me, who of men has set me up as a votive offering? Answer, Antiphates as a tithe. And in 7, it is not the object, but the reader who speaks as he interrogates, so to speak, the votive offering. Expertly crafted voice of the stone, tell me now, who has placed this statue here, lending splendor to Apollo's shrine? Panames, son of Caspolis, if you do urge me to speak up. As a tithe, he set this statue here up for the god. The answers in 6 and 7 are both helpful and clear, but there is a difference between the two. In 6, the votive object refers to itself in the personal first-person pronoun me, whereas in 7, you see that the aude tekneessa seems to refer to the stone, and then with the proximal deictic pronoun tend, as something else, something apart from the voice. Because, and so for Svenbro, and followed by Gregory Nagy in a number of publications, there is no real difference between these two scenarios because for them, for Svenbro, the pronoun hadde is so bound up with the first person that it becomes one of the prime markers of the steles or the votive object's egocentricity. This way you could translate the answer in 7 as Panami, son of Caspolis, set me up for the god as a tithe, as if tende equals me or eme. However, the pragmatics of the deictic pronoun hadde, which I briefly explored in a chapter in the Blackwell Companion to the Greek language, are, I think, an important linguistic argument precisely against egocentricity, the egocentric conception of the early epigram. It's true that hadde can be used by a speaker to refer or to point to himself, but that typically happens when he presents himself as something new, newsworthy to his interlocutor. A Greek speaker can say hadde paresti, this one here is present, in the sense of that is me here, as in a situation in Aristophanes' Birds, this is number 8. Who is the one who furnishes with wings all those who are arriving here? And then that is me here, hodi paresti. It appears then that instead of indulging in its egocentric self-importance, the monument presents itself as something newsworthy and of inherent interest to the reader and passerby. That means that in 7, whether we translate ten dane teke theoi as has set me up for the god or has set this object up for the god is in itself less important than that the object wants to be of interest to the reader who examines and observes it. Now, the question that the reader is projected to ask in these numbers 6 and 7, to which the monument gives the answer, is different from the imagined questions to which numbers 1 to 3 are the answers. Those questions pertain to the object itself. Who are you? And so on. Whose grave are you? Whereas here, the question is about, not about so much who is lying there, but about the one who dedicated the object, or the one who is responsible for the monument, for the grave. Who set you up as dedication? Who erected this stele, this monument? Now, as is well known, there is a shift in inscribed epigram from first person to third person discourse, a shift that is roughly datable to the middle of the 6th century. For Svenbro, this shift is the loss of the monument's egocentricity. But I would argue that it represents the rise of the focus on the object's dedicator, or the funerary monument's commissioner, a rise that may even go at the expense of attention to the deceased. The majority of archaic funerary verse inscriptions and their monuments stress the commissioner to such a degree that it defies the monument's purpose of being a memorial, a mnema, of the deceased person whose grave the reader is contemplating. In many cases, the name of the commissioner, as I will now call him or her, which is often the dead person's parent, is presented as at least as important as that of the dead person. And in some cases, the name of the person buried is not even given. Take a look at number 9. This tomb his father, Klebelos, for Xenophantos, has set up in recognition of his excellence and moderation. And then the next one, the tomb of Kylon has set up, this tomb Kylon has set up for his dead sons. No names of these dead children are given. In all this, there is a linguistic element that stands out next to the proximal deictic pronoun hode as a reader or reading-oriented signal. And that is the stereotypical aorist verb, aneteke in the case of dedications and epiteke or estese in the case of funeral monuments. It would be too simple to say that this is a past verb, simply a past verb. The temporal deixis here is more complex and interesting than that. The aorist verb bridges the temporal gap between the past act of erecting the monument or dedicating the object and the present act of contemplating it and reading the inscription. We could even say that the act denoted by the verb is not completed until the reader allows the monument to say that so-and-so has erected it. For a slightly different illustration of this idea, take a look at number 10, which is from Book 1 of Herodotus. Epempse Hemeas Croesus. The one who sent us here is Croesus, king of the Lydians and of other peoples, saying these words, Tade. Croesus has sent messengers to the Spartans, Epempse. But that act is not something that has happened in the past without further ado. It is a past act that feeds into the present of the messenger's arrival, because the messengers are only now delivering their message, Tade, which was the goal of the act, of Croesus's act, to begin with. The pronoun Tade represents the message as something new and newsworthy for the intended audience, and the verb epempse presents that message as the result of deliberate action in the past. To appreciate the special force of the aorist, we just have to replace it with an imperfect, epempen Hemeas Croesus, which would yield an entirely different meaning. We would now have a statement about the past, possibly part of a narrative. A possible audience reaction to it could be done, so Croesus sent you out as messengers, and what did he do then? The messengers would remain in the past as characters in a narrative, instead of being catapulted into the present as the agents that are responsible for the utterance, which is the performance of the statement. We could say even that the messengers are a monument that is movable and that embodies the words of the message, and that Croesus is the one who erected this monument. The living, moving monument refers to itself in the first person, epempse Hemeas, but instead of being egocentric, this self-reference is listener-oriented. It explains why the messengers are here. And this here is, in fact, a future here from the perspective of Croesus himself. The actual reception and fulfillment of the words of his message is projected onto some future moment. The difference between Croesus' messengers and the stone memorial is, of course, not only that the messengers can and do move, and the stone obviously cannot and will not, but also that whereas the reception of Croesus' message happens only one, the reception of the monument's message happens potentially indefinitely, over and over again, as long as the monument is standing. But what the two situations do have in common is that the inception of the act referred to by the aorist is less important than its completion. It is not quite relevant to know when precisely Croesus dispatched his messengers from Sardis to Sparta. What is important is that they are speaking now. Similarly, when exactly a given sepulchral monument was finished, or when the person buried there actually had died, is less important than that a reader reads about that monument in his own here and now, each time anew. The epigram is strongly reader-oriented, just as Croesus' message is directed to its Spartan audience. To recapitulate what I've done so far, the utterance of the stone or on the object can be the answer to two types of questions. One, who, whose, or what are you? And then two, who dedicated you? Who set you up? The answer to the second question may be either in the first person, so-and-so set me up, or in the third person, so-and-so set up this thing up. In one funeral text, which is one of my favorites in the archaic material, the two answers are combined, plus the inscription manages to blend in a third voice, that of the buried person himself, of which we saw some good examples also on the handout of Professor Gutzwiller. This is number 11. Greetings, passers-by. This is me here, lying dead. Come here and read. What man is buried here? A stranger from Aegina. Mnesitios is his name. And my dear mother, Timarete, has set up this monument on the top of the mound, an imperishable stele, that will say continuously for all days to come the following words: Timarete has set me up for her dear son who has died. Whereas in most cases it is the monument that addresses the passerby, here it is the deceased who utters an invitation to read. The text sets up the reader qua reader, since the exhortation can, of course, be received only when the reader is already reading. The question aner tis teide te taptai I take as a direct question on the part of the reader, or rather staged for the reader. This question can, of course, logically precedes the answer found in the act of reading, but the conceit is that it is subsumed in that act. The monument, in other words, does not oppose itself to the passerby and its question. It encompasses the passerby. It does not merely invite the act of reading, it embodies the act of reading, and the reader is part of the monument. The answer to the reader's question continues to be in the dead man's voice, who adds as supplemental information the answer to the second question, the question about who is responsible for the monument. In this way, the dead man's voice stages the voice of his own monument, which takes center stage in the last line of the text, Timarete me stese philoe epipaidi tanonti, which could well serve as a one hexameter inscription in its own right, without anything else. So this complex text contains three voices and is a compound containing two simpler types. That this is the grave of so-and-so type and the so-and-so has erected me type. Both the name of the deceased and that of the commissioner are highlighted, and the monument's commemorative function pertains to both. Let us now continue to think about this emphasis on the monument's commissioner and call him or her the monument's author. And if Timarete is the author of her son's monument, then we could call, and go even further, and call the presence of her name the monument's sphragus. Such a move would, of course, get us into the territory of Theognidian elegiac poetry, whose sense of authorship, I suggest, owes much to the monumental authorship that is enacted in archaic epigrams. The Theognidian sense of authorship stakes a natural starting point in the famous, or if you want, infamous Sfragus poem, of which I quote in 12 the beginning. Kerne, let hereby a Sfragus be placed by me, or as I would prefer even more, let Kerne hereby placed as a Sfragus as I perform my trick, in or with, by means of these very lines. And then their theft will never go unnoticed, nor will anyone change them for the worse, with the excellent element or the excellent person being present. And so will everyone speak, it's the lines of Theognis of Megara. He is named among all men. There is, of course, no time left to go into all the details, some of which are showing up in my translation. But I would like to suggest that what we are witnessing here is the placement, performatively, of the Sfragus, or in epigrammatic terms, the completion of a monument. So instead of the monumental aorist epitheke, we have a performative, passive, third-person imperative, epikaisto, let it be placed, or let it sit. And epikaimai is, of course, the passive equivalent of epitainai, which is also attested in the Midas epigram that you saw. Mida depisa mati kaimai, epikaimai, in Tmesis. Just as the bronze Parthenos stands on the tomb of Midas, so the Sfragus, which I personally believe is the vocative Kerne, stands on the verses of Theognis, referred to with the programmatic proximal deictic hode, tois de episin. The collection of sympathetic elegiac Theognis songs, this comes to function as Kurnos' tomb, commissioned by Theognis, whose fame is mediated by his poetic creation, just as Timaretes' fame is channeled through her dead son Mnesithios' tomb that she has commissioned. The commissioner or author is famous through his or her creation, but so is the person in whose honor or in whose commemoration the monument has been set up. The two have to rely on each other for their fame. This interdependence comes out in Theognis when we read the Sfragus poem in conjunction with the elegy in which Kurnos' fame is announced. And there are many reasons to take these poems together. This is number 13. To you I have given wings with which to the boundless sea you will fly, lifted over the entire earth easily. At feasts and at banquets you will be present at all of them, placed in the mouth of many, and with their pipes of clear sound, the young men, lovely in their decorous fashion, they will sing you beautiful and clear songs. And when in the depths of the gloomy earth you will go into the much wailing abode of Hades, you will never, not even in death, lose your kleos. No, you will be on the mind of the people, each time with a name unwilting. Kerne, roaming all over the land of Hellas and through the islands, crossing the barren sea rich in fish, not riding on horseback. Your vehicle instead will be the splendid gifts of the Muses, crowned with violets. And to all those who care, even men of the future, song you will be, equally to all, as long as earth and sun exist. But I do not even get the slightest respect from you. No, as if I'm a small boy, you are deceiving me with idle talk. This poem purports to be an announcement of eternal renown, but it is at the same time preoccupied with the addressee's death. And the elegy provides clear references to funerary epigram. Amidst the not-to-be-missed Homeric references in 245 and 6, which are at this time not my direct interest, we find the physical details of death in 243 and 4, and the epigrammatic indication of monumental eternity in 252, which is reminiscent of the Midas epigram, possibly in direct allusion. But the poem is also about the speaker's longing and the addressee's fleeing. The poem stages its addressee as not interested in soaring over the high seas in the eternal life that is provided by poetry. The two last lines of the poem may be on one level the fickle and unpredictable behavior of the typical eromenos, who is unwilling to play by the rules, social or sexual, but on a more metapoetic level, this is a stance that equates everlasting fame with death, poetry with epigram, and inscribed speech endowed stones with the silence of the grave. The Theognis collection contains a speaking voice that can be read as the expression of this idea, and could thus serve as Kurnos's answer to the fame elegy. This is number 14. Enjoying my youth, I romp and play. There is not time enough for me to lie under the earth, deprived of my soul, speechless like a stone, or just like an unspeaking stone. As I leave the lovely light of the sun, and noble as I may be, I will not be able to see. This is a sympathetic anti-epigram. The Carpe Diem style celebration of life over death, stone is not introduced as a benchmark of voiceless, not just introduced as a benchmark of voicelessness, speechless just as stone, but also, pointedly, I think, as the fundamental muteness of the aude techne essa, of the inscribed stele. Speechless, as like a speechless stone, whose silence under the eternal sun is the silence of death. Inscribed epigram, this serves in a number of ways as a model for Theognis' poetry. Its inherent writtenness, thingness, purported permanence, and the increasing prominence of the name of its commissioner provides a natural template for the notion of sphragus, an author's signature on the written work. And this line will extend beyond Theognis and beyond poetry, also to authors like Thucydides. Equally important as the name recognition of Theognis himself is Kurnos's fame, which is presented as the kleos conferred by poetry. From the perspective of the body of Theognidian poetry, which is highly conscious of its own writtenness, poetic fame is conceived as a monument, a tomb, and Theognis' elegiac poetry as equivalent to an epigram. If Theognidian poetry participates in the programmatic critique of inscribed monuments and their purported everlasting durability, it is in the voice of the symposiast, whose celebration of life is tantamount to the rejection not only of the tomb itself, but also of what is written on it. Thank you.
Well, very many thanks to Egbert for that wonderful paper, which put texts, or sort of crafted words on stone and crafted words on papyrus on an equal footing, and showed us them in dialogue and showed us them as part of a cultural story. So very many thanks. We now have Don Levine, who's worked on authors ranging from Archilochus to Martial, is particularly interested in iambus, and now is going to broaden his range still further by telling us about the Iliad on epigram.
I'd like to echo everyone's thanks to the organizers for having us here. I'm especially delighted to have had a reason to get far away from Texas this week, as our legislature in its wisdom has now approved the carrying of firearms on their side. So it truly is cowboys and running around in Texas now. So happy to be here. My talk today deals with the generic interaction between Homeric epic and early sepulchral epigram, especially as concerns the two genres' shared goal of memorialization. In particular, I'm interested in the way in which the Homeric poems represent, exploit, and otherwise use epigrammatic monumentality. The most famous epigrammatic moment in Homer is from Iliad 7, Hector's epigrammatic performance at the hypothetical tomb of an unknown soldier. This is handout 8A on your page, but I'll get back to it later. Scholars, many in this room, have seen the significance of this passage for archaic Greek epigram, some arguing that the passage is evidence of a pre-generic conflict, others of a kind of coordination. Most read the passage as a Homeric prefiguring of an epigrammatic mode that will later become normative in actual epigrammatic funerary practice. Recently, though, Jenny Strauss-Clay has argued that the passage gives evidence of Homer's response to archaic Greek epigram proper, and thus gives us the epic's only clear reference to writing. While I would balk at endorsing her argument totally, Strauss-Clay does reveal the possibility of a Homeric response to early archaic epigram. As Oswald has recently argued in his excellent Princeton dissertation, quote, the traditional literary to epigraphic poetic flow of intertextual influence is problematic, and only one of a number of options that could exist, such as the other direction or both directions. It's in this light, then, that I would like to examine the way in which Homer styles tombs in the epics, that is, as a response to the memorializing aims of sepulchral epigram. In his recent study of time in the Iliad, Garcia has argued that tombs and other material objects are complements to the Homeric idea of kleos. Based on an interpretation of the formula kleos aphthiton, he argues that Homeric kleos always encodes a sense of its own eventual decay and demise. Thus, tombs and other seemingly durable constructions provide a glimpse of the impending loss of memory to which even Homeric poetry itself will succumb. Although I agree with Grethlein that Garcia's particular argument is mistaken, Garcia's general point about the Iliad's presentation of the decay of tombs, along with the memories they represent, still has significance for our interpretation of the poetics of Homeric epic. In fact, Grethlein has also recognized Homer's presentation of the limited lifespan of objects, tombs included, in the epic. Although he's right to point to the relative inadequacy of such objects as memorial devices, such objects are nonetheless depicted as encoding memory, as Naj has shown, arguing that tombs in particular contain modes of memorialization that run parallel to the poetics of epic kleos. As Grethlein has argued, from the point of view of the Homeric poems, the physical decay to which tombs succumb is a negative foil to the everlasting glory of epic song. However, if we reverse the direction of our critical lens and look at the epic poems from the point of view of archaic epigrammatic monuments, their very monumentality can be seen as an attempt to participate in the everlasting kleos of epic. In fact, several inscriptions on archaic tombs attempt to realize the kind of fame promised by Homeric epic, often cast in language and meter shared with the Homeric tradition. This is number 1 on your handout. It's a very famous example. But I would say also that the epigram is only one piece of a multimedia monument, right? And this is important. I don't have time to discuss in detail the epigrammatic side of things, but I give you handouts 2 and 3 as an example, as some examples to think about. My basic take is that each monument exploits its spatiality and materiality, often expressed in the epigrams, and works in competition with other surrounding monuments to extend its kleos through time and space. And handout 3 is a collection of monuments that would have been in the same location in Corcyra by about 550. As I've argued elsewhere, such monuments strive to promote the kleos of the men and women they conceal through poetry that resonates with the Homeric epics, but they also exploit their site specificity to legitimate their claims to fame. So, the poem on the stone presents merely one part of the archaic funerary monument, which read in its totality, that is, in its monumentality and spatiality, as well as in its poetic program, such monuments act, as Sven Rowe has argued, as machines to produce kleos. And thus, each epigrammatic monument deploys its configuration of features in order to participate in the premier archaic mode of memorialization. If, from the point of view of the funeral monument, tomb and epic are part of the same system of memorialization, and from the point of view of the epics, tombs are inferior and qualitatively different modes of memorialization, then we're justified in postulating a competition in memorialization among the two modes. In an effort to understand the Homeric poetics of this competition, I will now turn to an analysis of the tombs in the epics, looking at the occurrence of Tumbos Sema and the one of Arion. There's a list of everything in handout number 9 for your reference. In this analysis, I will give a glimpse of the way in which the Iliad ironizes and calls into question the memorializing potential of epigrammatic funerary monuments, thus implicitly showcasing its own superior poetics of memorialization. Before I turn to a detailed analysis of several of the tombs in Homer, I would like to offer a brief overview of the broad categories of the poetic treatment of tombs in the epics. This is the same material that Servnew Inwood categorizes, but I do so differently. First, and perhaps most obviously, many of the Homeric examples reference the importance of space, so important to epigrammatic monuments, and through the alteration of the landscape implicit in their erection. Second, and much differently from the archaic examples, Homeric tombs are isolated. Overall, the tombs all fall into two basic categories: actual and hypothetical tombs. By actual, I mean tombs that are or will be extant from the broad Homeric narrative point of view. So Achilles' tomb counts as real because it's actually completed and referred to in the epics. By hypothetical, I mean tombs that are imagined but never to be realized. For example, a tomb is used in a simile of the immovability of the horses of Peleus after the death of Automedon. Surprisingly, of all the tombs I reviewed, only one actual tomb and one hypothetical tomb are located in Greece proper. The tomb of Iapetus in Arcadia, which is listed in the catalog of ships and used as a geographical marker and paired with Mount Selene, and then the would-be tomb of Odysseus on Ithaca. Within these two large categories, actual and hypothetical, there are some common ways of treating tombs. Of the actual tombs, some are used primarily as geographic markers, some to denote the geros thananton, to clearly signify and or enhance the kleos of the deceased, and perhaps strangely, one seems to act primarily as a marker of blame. Within the group of hypothetical tombs, one is styled as an indicator of kleos for the deceased, or perhaps simply geros thananton. Others are presented primarily to announce the deceased's loss of kleos. Two function, again surprisingly, as markers of blame, and one, as I just mentioned, is used in the simile to denote rootedness in place. In an effort to unpack the poetic strategies that govern the Homeric use of tombs, I'll turn to an analysis of the representative examples from each of the categories I just described. I'll treat them basically following the order presented in handout number 9. First, we'll start with the actual tombs. As I said, all of the tombs in the epics are tied closely to a place, and several are basically limited to signifying geographical information. The tombs of Iapetus, that's the only one in Greece, Iseetes, which uses a lookout tower by Polites, Elos, which is often used as a marker of space in the plain, and the Greek wall, which functions as a common tomb of the slain Achaean masses, but all of these are used primarily to signify spatial relations in Troy. They do still encode kleos in as much as they publish the name of the deceased, but this function is subsidiary to their function as geographical features, a fact made most clear in the example of the Greek wall, which not only encodes no names, but will be demolished by Poseidon when the war ends. The ability of such monuments to publish a name is overtly challenged in the epics, especially in the Iliad, in the two passages listed under handout number 4. The tomb of Myrine in Iliad 2 and the tomb of the unknown mortal in Iliad 23. These examples are especially telling. First, the tomb of Myrine, which is called the hill Batiaea by mortals, but known by gods as the tomb Sema of Myrine, light of step. Time withers the memorializing potential of heaped earth and suggests that, over time, an altered landscape alone cannot support kleos. Much the same thing can be argued based on Nestor's Ariphrades Sema for Antilochus, which describes the turning post of the chariot race in Iliad 23 as either the tomb, Sema, of some dead guy, or an old turning post. It's precisely Nestor's epic words that make clear what this Sema actually is, and without his words, the truth is ambiguous at best. That is, the epic here in the mouth of Nestor provides a subtle hint through the repetition and redefinition of Sema in this passage that the words of epic memorialization trump the signifying power of a stick and some stones. Turning to the next group of actual tombs, we find that most are related to the rites due to the dead. The tomb of Sarpedon, handout number 5A, which Zeus ordains, presents this type most clearly. Styled as a Gerasthonanton, the epics are relatively silent on the fame such tombs will transmit. Of course, it's implicit that a tomb should encode the name of the deceased, but the epics do not focus upon their memorializing function. Some tombs are depicted, as the due of the dead, but with greater emphasis on the class they might signify. A clear example is the tomb of Agamemnon, handout 5B. Built by Menelaus for his dead brother, so that Agamemnon might have asbeston kleos. Menelaus has to pile up this mound in order to gain safe passage home, so it parallels nicely the tomb of Elpenor built by Odysseus, handout 5C. This tomb is the only one in the epics to have an individuating marker on it, the oar that Elpenor used in his life as a member of Odysseus's crew. It's planted on the top of the barrow in order to signify the man whose death the monument memorializes. But the tenuousness of each of these tombs is at least suggested in the remoteness of their locations. One somewhere on a shore in Egypt and the other on the shore of Aiaia, topped with an oar. Both, like the actual epigrams we've seen, are concerned with their visibility through their location and thus their ability to transmit kleos, but given the lack of surrounding context, the epics don't offer much in the way of surety that the memorializing goals of these tombs will persist. In fact, one might see the epic here as appropriating the memorializing function of these two mounds in an effort to highlight its superior mode of memorialization. The most famous tomb in the epics is, of course, that of Achilles and Patroclus. The description of the tomb by Agamemnon in Odyssey 24, which is handout 5D, elaborates its memorializing function. The fact that the muses are there singing the threnos for Achilles suggests the staying power of the kleos encoded by this mound. The guarantors of truth and poetry, the kleos of epic, vouchsafe the signifying function of this tomb from the time Achilles is deceased. This tomb, well placed for all to see, present and future, will be enhanced by the poetry begun by the muses and continued in the epics themselves. Achilles' tomb then does function in a way similar to the archaic examples we've seen, but it does so in isolation from other tombs. It needs no context because the epic tradition stands as its epigram. Achilles' kleos flies, but not primarily in association with the pile of dirt that sits atop his bones. Thus, this exceptional tomb highlights the problem of Homeric tombs vis-a-vis the archaic sepulchral monuments. By depicting tombs as isolated mounds, epic showcases the power of its verse to affect kleos, and Achilles' tomb is the premier example. Before Achilles' tomb is Achilles, though, it is the tomb of Patroclus. In the Iliad, this tomb is put to interesting use. Of course, it's used as a site of competition and thus kleos for the assembled Greeks and for Patroclus as well. But after the funeral games of Iliad 23, it becomes a signifier of blame. Throughout Book 24, the tomb becomes the central focus of Achilles' attempts to debase Hector, handout 6. Achilles' constant dragging of Hector's body around the tomb thus reverses the earlier Greek celebratory focus on the tomb, offering a distorted image of the typical function of such monuments, with some irony, as we'll see. However, the blame function of the tomb that Achilles exploits parallels the typical depiction of hypothetical tombs in the epics, the majority of which function as markers of kleos, lost, or extremely as markers of blame. Another tomb of Achilles that was threatened to be heaped up upon him by the river Xanthus clearly exposes the use of the tomb to denote the loss of kleos. It's handout 7a. This tomb, placed under the flow of the river and invisible to humans, will erase Achilles from the face of the earth. Though this is the extreme position, an almost inverted tomb boss, the description reveals the negative potential of the sema that no one recognizes, the tomb that fails to transmit the commemorative information its erection entailed. Further, this tomb presents a hypothetical outcome that is opposed to the actual outcome of the Trojan War as presented in Homer. This too will prove to be a property of all the hypothetical tombs I'll discuss today. Of these hypothetical tombs, only that of Odysseus is styled in both a positive and a negative light, and thus the hypothetical tomb of Odysseus on Ithaca offers the sole exception to this generally negative pattern, though it, like Xanthus's threatened tomb for Achilles, has a counterfactual orientation, and thus encodes an ultimately negative memorial. Odysseus is endowed with two hypothetical tombs, one on Ithaca, the other in Troy. The tomb in Troy, handout 7b, that the Achaeans would have built had he died there, offers a stark contrast to the reality of the situation as seen from the pessimist's point of view, namely that of Telemachus and Eumaeus. However, the irony here lies in the fact that this lost tomb and the lost kleos it would have encoded is nothing compared with the actual kleos Odysseus will win by not having been buried in this imagined tomb. The irony is brought home in the repetition of these lines in Odyssey 24, when Achilles laments Agamemnon's fate at the hands of Aegisthus. While seemingly positive, Odysseus's hypothetical tomb on Ithaca, which is handout 7c, would be a cenotaph designed to solidify his son's position, effecting the replacement of Odysseus by his son and signaling a transformation of the basic story of Odysseus's Nostos. While the tomb would indicate the kleos of Odysseus, it would be an impoverished version of the fame that is his due in his eponymous epic. This tomb would entail the loss of his wife and a transferal of his full kingly station to his son, and his defining act of manly arete would be accomplished by Telemachus. This tomb, in short, would signify a decidedly down-market brand of kleos, especially in contrast to the kleos encoded in the hexameters of the poem. Hypothetical tombs then generally mark a loss of kleos, even as they refer to the potential kleos such a tomb might grant the deceased. The last two items on the handout totally subvert the typical archaic model of epigrammatic memorialization in their depictions of hypothetical tombs, reversing the direction of kleos from the vanquished to the vanquisher. We might be tempted to see this distinction as fundamental to the difference between epigrammatic and epic memorialization. In my last few minutes, I'd like to return to handout number 8a, Hector's performance of his enemy's epigram. In contrast to epigrammatic practice, in Hector's mind, this sema will carry his kleos, rather than that of the unnamed and slaughtered Greek. This is a significant reversal. Further, when we look at this passage in light of Hector's role in the Homeric tradition, we could read this performance with Naj as highly ironic. I'd push this irony a bit further and see it as a point at which the epic tradition opposes itself to the tradition of epigram by way of appropriation. In other words, in this passage, epic poetry acknowledges its affinities to epigram and shows its superiority. The superiority lies in pointing out, via irony, the very malleability of the interpretation of semata, a process which is left in the hands of private individuals rather than professionals and the poetic tradition they shepherd. I think the passage from Iliad 4, which is 8b, does much the same thing. In fact, Hector is right that his glory will never die, but not in the terms his interpretation of a future sema overlooking the Hellespont suggests. As the Iliad guarantees, Hector's fame will be eternally tied to his own death at the hands of the best of the Greeks, a fame enshrined in the hexameter of epic, not the pentameter of an epigram. The cycle of irony is complete when we recall the other tomb I argued might be considered a vehicle of blame, namely Patroclus's tomb, which was repeatedly used as a locus of Achilles' abuse of Hector. Dragging Hector around the tomb of the man he killed, Achilles' abuse ironizes the sentiment encoded in Hector's epigram. but also it encodes a hint of the competition between the two modes. Whereas Hector imagines a tomb of a dead Greek that celebrates his Klaus's slayer, Homer depicts the actual tomb of Patroclus as the vehicle around which the best of the Achaeans celebrates the slaying of Hector. And lest we forget, this is the same tomb that will eventually cover the dead body of Achilles and signify, through the authority of the epic tradition, his unwilting Klaus. In a way, then, the Iliad itself is a replacement for the tomb of Achilles, and any epigram it might bear, focusing not on the death of the hero, but on the hero's dynamic action in battle, not on a static tomb, but in the winged words of the poet's verse. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Don, for another very, very interesting paper, which linked up very nicely with Egbert's and continued this idea of a sort of polemical dialogue on memorialization. It sort of brought out what very interesting places tombs are and a sort of site for lots of human action and talk. And now we pass to Michael Tuller, who also is a very wide-ranging scholar who's written on things from Virgil to inscriptions, and is particularly interested in Hellenistic poetry, and is producing the Lerb of the Palatine Anthology, No Light Task. He's going to talk to us today about words for dying in sepulchral epigram.
I too would like to join the chorus of speakers who've thanked our generous hosts for this wonderful and stimulating conference. Unfortunately, I have, I'm afraid, only a buffet of death to bring to this potluck. Survey drawn from some of the work I'm currently doing on Book 7 of the Greek Anthology. A stereotypical grave marker in the US begins with the phrase, "Here lies," followed by the name of the deceased. Nothing more is needed to know that the person is dead. From the beginning, however, Greek sepulchral epigram was more explicit. It was quite some time before a simple chemi became sufficient. Up through the classical period, the great majority of inscribed epigrams employed some word meaning die or kill. And while euphemism was always possible, it was rarely desirable. The trend, rather, was toward more narrative epigrams, which tended to increase the attention paid to the event of death itself. In this paper, I will focus on the actual words and a few longer locutions used to denote death in sepulchral epigram. While many words were pressed into service for this function, given the time constraints, I will trace just a few from their archaic beginnings through the end of the Greek Anthology. The oldest epigrams express death with the word olume and its compounds. The primary function of this word is to indicate death. This function is independent of the grammatical construct in which the word is employed. A few examples will show what I mean. In passages 1 through 5, the LSJ tells us that we have a few different meanings of the word, active meanings to destroy and to lose, and then middle meanings that function more like passives than usual. They mean something like to perish and to be lost. Certainly when we translate olume, we must take these definitions into account, but they really say very little about how olume works. After all, Greek would not use the word to denote the loss or demise of just anything. Almost universally, the only thing that can be lost or perish with this word is some equivalent for the life or the person himself. We must understand, then, that the word means death. Its actual translation is secondary. In the active meaning destroy, the word also has a very limited set of subjects. At first, the most common subject is the one seen in passage 1, Ares. Only divine beings or notionally divine forces may play this role. Other epigrams, some of which may be quite early, assign it to fate or time. But there is a problem with such abstract divinities. At times they can be difficult to separate from human action or even from the deceased himself. An epigram on Philetus cited by Athenaeus, passage 7, has Philetus dying a victim of his own thoughts and words, and another, passage 8, has a sailor dying a victim of his own pathos, his longing to return home. In other words, these two both died as a result of their own personality defects. Divine forces have become highly personalized. But sometimes the divine forces that defeat the deceased are more easily envisioned. In fact, the earliest example we have of the sepulchral use of olume, passage 6, features the sea in this role. The sea and its components, wind and wave and the like, continued to be very popular as subjects of Olume in the Hellenistic period. This is true to such an extent that the theme can be played ironically. Antipater of Thessalonica gives us passage 9, in which a sailor who survives the sea then dies by falling into shallow water, apparently while drunk. In the 6th century CE, Julian the Prefect brings both strands together in passage 10. On the one hand, he denies that sea and wind destroyed the deceased, but then he blames a different abstract divinity, Eros, and this is not even the usual Eros, but rather love of profit. The intransitive use of Olume, meaning to die, traveled a different path. Perses, one of the very earliest Hellenistic epigrammatists, and one often considered pretty dull, I'll confess I've been guilty on that score, innovates here in a way that has gone unnoticed. He begins passage 11 with oleo. This seems dull enough. Certainly it does not seem much different from the oleta of passage 2, but in fact what difference there is quite significant. Prior to Perses, that precise form, the second person singular of the aorist indicative middle, had, as far as we know, only been used once in Greek, and that is in passage 12. Its occurrence is the first line of the first lament for Hector, the capstone of the Iliad. Perses thus apostrophizes the deceased and brings her case vividly to mind, while at the same time ennobling her by an allusion to a great lament. It is also worth noting that the allusion is specifically to funerary lament. The remoteness of a tomb thus slips away, and the reader is plunged into the immediacy of the funeral. And who is the person so honored? A 14-year-old girl. Or, on the other hand, rather than the allusion honoring the deceased, perhaps it is the poetic lament itself that is being depreciated. Anate may be implying as much in her epigram 10 when she applies the same word, prominently positioned as the first word in the epigram, just as Perses had done, to a dog, just a puppy really, who had died of snakebite. From then on, the form olea and its compounds become a commonplace in sepulchral epigram, both serious and ironic, both book epigram and real inscribed epitaphs. Strangely, however, other than in epigram, the word's only attestations in all of Greek literature remain the Iliad line and specific citations of it. Next, kteno. Given that death in battle was the fate most deserving of memorialization in epigram, we would expect that kteno would be prominent. In fact, it makes its appearance relatively late, and tentatively. It first appears in a famous epigram from the Persian War, passage 13, and we see immediately how it differs from Olume. Whereas Olume ennobled death in battle as the work of Ares or of fate, here the agent is the Persians. The fact that Megistius died at their hands does nothing to ennoble his death. We must assume that Simonides composed the epigram in the way he did because he was keen to blame the Persians, that is, to lay the blame for Megistius' death on them. Certainly, given the connotations of Olume that we have just seen, he could not make the Persians the subject of oleson. The verb kteno thus becomes a logical choice, and its first appearance in epigram is an accusation, nested in a participial phrase that shows the Persians transgressing boundaries. Kteno proved its usefulness here, but Simonides may have been a bit too far ahead of his time. The word may have seemed to its early readers to be too pedestrian, though Herodotus, it is true, has no complaint, and believes that Simonides was acting out of goodwill. In any case, kteno does not appear in epigram again, as far as I can tell, for more than 100 years. Then Aristotle uses it in passage 14, the epigram for Hermias. Here it is even more clear that the context is accusation. Again, it is the Persians who do the killing, and they do so in violation of pretty much all that is holy. Kteno then goes on to be quite popular in Hellenistic epigram, but it does not lose its connotation. Sometimes its subject is simply enemies, but its most common subject is murderers, though predatory animals, cruel family members, pirates, and the like also make appearances. The two verbs, olume and kteno, seem to have divided up the work of killing. Olume covered divine, often indirect or obscure causation. Kteno covered the efficient cause. In that light, the few times that divinities are the subject of kteno take on additional nuance. In passage 15, Zeus kills Orpheus. He does not do so indirectly. Rather, he sends a lightning bolt that strikes him down. Even more striking is passage 16, in which Fate kills Ajax. The Fates would seem to be the paradigmatic case of divine agency for which olume would be warranted. And elsewhere, Fate is found as the subject of olesen. But Ajax's death presents problems. In fact, the second couplet of the epigram can be seen as a justification not simply for the fact that Ajax's death was a suicide, but also for the use of the word kteno in the first couplet. Fate is not literally the direct cause of Ajax's death, Ajax himself was, but nevertheless, fate took more direct action than usual. Why? Because no other efficient cause could be found. The second couplet implies that the subject of kteno should ordinarily be sought en thnaitoise. Only when this is impossible must the gods move on their own. I've looked at two words for killing. Let's shift to words that more clearly denote dying. The earliest and at first most common of these is phtheo and its compounds, which invariably appear in the aorist middle. Phtheo is there from the very beginning, in epigrams like passage 3. The great majority of the time, throughout the history of Greek epigram, it takes participial form and subordinates itself to other ideas in the epigram. In passage 3, both Phimenon and Olesanta are subordinate to the request for mourning in the first couplet. Passage 17 is a typical case. The participle is closely associated both with the idea of the mnema and with grief for the deceased. This is not saying very much. In fact, the participle phimenos is nearly always redundant in inscribed sepulchral epigram. The epigrams almost always give other indications that they are about a dead person, either by directly saying death has occurred, or more commonly by a mention of a mnema for the person or by indications of lament. The participle simply places the label deceased very clearly, even though the reader could surely figure it out on her own. There are a few exceptions to this rule of redundancy, such as passage 18, which is not very formulaic. Although the verb echo, which is repeated 3 times here, is an indicator of a tomb, it is not a very strong one. The strongest indicator of death is the participle phimenos. The epigram artfully builds to 2 occurrences of it at the very end. In fact, this epigram in part establishes a new pattern for phimenos. It carefully differentiates 2 phases of existence, while the 2 people were alive and after they died. By marking the boundary of death, phimenos thus allows the narrative of life to continue past it. Narrative considerations also motivate the few occurrences of phtheo as a finite verb. Passage 19, the first such occurrence, serves as a good example. The first couplet here is given all the necessary information, but the second gives a brief history of Cratista's death in childbirth. The same is true for all later uses of a finite phtheo. They are never simple statements that death has occurred, but always occur in narratives with some level of detail about the death. Occasionally, the participle plays this role as well. I'm not going to give examples of book epigram here. They exist, but they are no different from what we have already seen. Hellenistic poets did not find the word a fruitful field for innovation. In fact, phtheo goes into a slow decline in the Hellenistic period. While it appears twice in Anate's small oeuvre and 4 times in Leonidas of Tarentum, Callimachus uses it only once, and most of his contemporaries not at all. A third of its appearances in the Garland of Meleager are in poems that are attributed, whether rightly or wrongly, to pre-Hellenistic poets, or in anonymous poems that give the appearance of great age. While Antipater of Sidon uses the word 4 times, Meleager uses it only once, and its decline continues from there. In the entire cycle of Agathias, it occurs only 5 times. What then of thnesko? No other word indicates death more clearly than thnesko. It makes its appearance at essentially the same time as phtheo, and in very much the same way, as a participle. Passage 20 gives an example. There we see the genitive participle thanontos, much as we saw apophthemenoia in passage 17, and it is again closely associated with the sema and with grief. Again, it is redundant. If it were omitted, it would not be missed. Unlike phtheo, however, thnesko soon begins to appear frequently as a finite verb. The earliest example is in passage 17 itself and is typical of other early uses. While ethane is grammatically primary in its cause, the primary focus of the clause is not on it. It is on Cleoitius's goodness as he died. While goodness is very generic, epigrams like passage 21 are more typical and report a specific kind of goodness. The deceased died in battle. Again, though thane is the finite verb, the emphasis is clearly on the combat rather than the death. Both of the 2 uses I've discussed so far in which thnesko is subordinate to other ideas continue with very little change or diminution through to the cycle of Agathias, though many other uses are added to them. One interesting variation is passage 22, in which Chairemon modifies the participle battling to instead indicate the results of the battle, redrawing borders. As Gow and Page point out, it is possible that Chairemon makes this adaptation in order to emphasize that Cleos was buried in the very land he had helped to acquire. At this point, thnesko begins to expand its repertoire of functions in earnest. Passage 23 shows both the finite verb and the participle thnesko closely attached to statements that are clearly intended to generate an emotional response in the reader. The most common such statements are the two seen here, dying too young and dying far from one's home and friends. While it might seem possible to connect these sentiments to verbs such as theo and olume, in fact, they tend strongly to occur just with thnesko. And we do not find only negative sentiments. We also find exactly the reverse, a death that is fortunate because it occurred after a long, full life, or in the arms of friends. The most unusual feature of thnesko is the weighty implications it attaches to tense. Among the inscribed epigrams, time is governed by fairly strict rules. Present time can be used only of things that are present at the time and place of reading. In the epigrams of mid-4th century Attica, however, thnesko begins to show the one significant exception to this rule. It may appear in the present tense, even when its intended time is clearly past. Passage 24 presents one of the clearest examples. All of the verbs here are set in the past, and all are aorist, except for thnesko, which is in the present, despite the fact that past time is its clear setting. I can only assume that this peculiar exception is made in order to bring the death more vividly in mind to the reader. This phenomenon is almost exclusively a feature of inscribed epigram and of the classical period. Only a few authors of the Greek anthology seem to have grasped it. Leonidas once invokes it in AP 7-163, and then it lies dormant until Meleager. Meleager only uses thnesko in the present tense, and once in passage 25 shows that he knows exactly what he is doing. Just as in passage 24, we see here a series of verbs that all refer to the past, and they are all in real past tenses, except thnesko. After Meleager, the phenomenon rapidly dies out. The perfect tense is also imbued with particular meaning. Passage 26 is the earliest use of the perfect of thnesko in epigram and is typical of the trend that follows. Here, tephnasia, as we would expect, represents the permanence of death, as opposed to the simple fact of dying, which we see here in thanontis. Epigrams that use the perfect nearly always make this focus explicit, usually by comparing the state of being dead to the state of being alive, whether with some kind of hope, as here, or with resignation. This trend lasts through the Garland of Meleager. In the Garland of Philip, it is dissipated, and in epigrams of later generations, the perfect and the aorist of the word lose all distinction and can freely be substituted for one another. It is also with the Garland of Meleager that we get the change in the use of thnesko that is most significant for its continued survival in epigram, the reason that it persists where theo drops away. The change may be seen in passage 27. In a moment, I will talk about the way this epigram generates emotion, but for now I want to focus on just the word ethane in line 7. If you think there is nothing special about this use, you're right. The word serves no function here beyond moving forward the narrative of the death. Thnesko at this point broke free of the connections I've discussed so far and became the ordinary word used to say he died when the story called for it. Callimachus, as we'll see in a moment, would complain about the word's constant use, but the word's sheer usefulness won out. So far, I've looked at words that clearly mean death, but poets could take a more circuitous route to the subject. Phrases on the order of descending into the darkness or leaving the light of the sun are used as early as the second quarter of the 5th century. These travel metaphors are ineffective as euphemisms since they obscure nothing. The darkness is clearly Hades and is often labeled as such in the very same poem. This strongly implies that soothing tender feelings is not the motivation for their use. Simonides, however, does seem to have consolatory intentions in his adaptation of the metaphor in passage 26. Here, the darkness, rather than being a domain one enters, is more similar to clothing. Even though death is named explicitly, the men don the dark cloud of death, Simonides consistently aims to diminish its effects. He does this by counterbalancing the cloud of death with an opposite clothing in the first line, the men also wrap their homeland in glory. In the second couplet, Simonides' consolatory purpose becomes explicit. He states plainly that the men, though they have died, are not dead. And when he mentions travel in Hades, the direction is the opposite of what one would expect for a sepulchral epigram. These men's excellence rises from Hades triumphant. Leonidas of Tarentum is particularly creative in his use of metaphor to speak of death. He rarely hints at a consolatory purpose, however. Rather, his metaphors are crafted to connect the death to the surrounding narrative. I'll begin with a simple example, passage 27. Leonidas spends 2 couplets setting up our expectations. Theris is a fisherman who has seen every variety of danger at sea. But then the third couplet tells us he did not die, notice that the word is a compound of olume, from divine forces like star or storm. Leonidas then in the 4th couplet abruptly shifts the scene. Now we are in a grass hut, a far more peaceful setting than we have seen so far. Inside such a hut, we would expect to find a lamp and this lamp represents the way the man died, with the gentle guttering of the flame as it exhausts the last of its fuel. His comrades in fishing then return at the end to build his tomb. One might detect some consolation here, but in fact that consolation can only be given because the man's story so obviously leads to it. The simile of being snuffed by time like a lamp parallels the peaceful interior passing of Theris. Other epigrams of Leonidas are not at all reassuring. In passage 28, the deceased, another fisherman, reaches the end of his fated thread as he thrashes about amidst his fishing lines. In passage 29, a toddler tastes death. While the expression tasting death is not so uncommon for us, it virtually never appears in Greek. Leonidas' metaphor is thus very striking. This child, who, as we can imagine, puts everything in his mouth, does so also with death. In passage 30, Calliskris slipped out of life just as easily as his ship slips through the water. Later epigrammatists, while not entirely shy of deploying metaphor, tend to restrict its range much more than Leonidas. Metaphors of sleep, in fact, outnumber all others. Sleep and death are brothers. There's a family resemblance. The body is inactive when subject to either. This inaction is the theme when the euphemism of sleep is approached for the first time in passage 31. Autotos here rests his body from toil, a result that sounds pretty positive, especially for a miner whose toils were presumably difficult indeed. In fact, given that this metaphor is applied here for the first time, the epigram runs the risk of unclarity. Is Autotos actually dead, or is his shift just over? Only the fact that the epigram is inscribed leads one to conclude that the cessation of labor is permanent. Miners generally did not enjoy any retirement. They stopped working when they died, but if retirement is a real possibility, even a permanent end to labor could be ambiguous. Passage 32, which appears after Leonidas has inaugurated the tradition of retirement epigrams, toys with the reader. This woman has put aside her shuttle, but still seems pretty spry at first. Only with the final couplet do sepulchral formulas clearly intrude. With Kaireto and the count of the generations she has seen, we infer that the woman must be dead. I do not wish to give the impression that sleep is always unclear. With the proper phrasing, it can be anchored unmistakably in death. Callimachus hits on a winner in passage 33. By using two words for sleep, one is the object of the other, and then following up by observing that this is the sleep due to all, Callimachus euphemizes without the possibility of misunderstanding. It is no surprise that this formula, with very little variation, is adopted by many epigrammatists later. Callimachus, for all his notorious irony, habitually expresses himself very delicately when it comes to death. We might well see him as an advocate for this kind of euphemism. Passage 34 has long been seen as parallel to passage 26. Callimachus is saying that Acanthus, because of his goodness, will, in a sense, never really die. I don't wish to deny this reading, but Callimachus is doing something more here. By using the imperative lega, he is making a point about vocabulary. We should not say that good people die. We should euphemize. Again, as in passage 33, Callimachus' euphemism is not susceptible to misinterpretation. Sleeping the sacred sleep can only be death. But actual death is simply not something we should say. That said, I admit I do find ironic ambiguity more interesting, so I want to end with passage 35. A toddler playing by a cistern is an image to disturb any parent. When Archaeanax falls, we are relieved to hear that his mother snatched him out, even though she does so with the verb harpazo, which is so often used of Hades. We wonder if she has arrived in time. The final couplet, however, is deeply unsatisfying. The child, we read, did not pollute the nymphs. Okay, so he did not die in the water. But does that mean that he did not die? Or that he did not die there? The answer is that he has the deep sleep on his mother's knees. Unlike passages 33 and 34, this is not clearly the sleep that is due to all or the sacred sleep. It is the deep sleep. My own poetic sense here tells me that a lot is resting on the definite article here. It would be much different to say the child is having a deep sleep. To me, that sounds like the kind of sleep a child has subsequent to a traumatic experience. First he is shocked, then he wails until he is exhausted, and then he sleeps. But the deep sleep sounds more definite and permanent. On the other hand, I could be wrong. The article could simply refer to the kind of sleep that is appropriate to a 3-year-old, or the article might not matter at all. The simple presence of 2 words for sleep might be enough to suggest death. Or the presence of the word deep, recalling the depth of the water, could imply that he drowned even after he was pulled out. I welcome suggestions on this point, but I'm inclined to see the conclusion here as an intentional failure of euphemism. The anxiety with which the narrative builds leads perfectly to irresolution, in which the reader feels not only that she must know how the story ends, but that she has already been told how it ends, but just can't quite get it clearly. This inability to see clearly when death is the subject is itself probably a large part of the point. This paper can give only a sampling of the ways in which sepulchral epigrams spoke of death. I've barely touched on metaphors of travel and have omitted a number of locutions involving darkness or underworld divinities, as well as a host of interactions with the noun thanatos, among others. Nevertheless, a few conclusions can be drawn. Death, Epicurus said, is nothing to us. He has his own reasons, but one reason is that no one has ever told us what death is like. Despite its obvious significance, it is an empty signifier, ready to accept any meaning we put onto it. This may most easily be seen in the word theo, which for all its literal meaning adds nothing to most of the epigrams in which it appears. It can be, and eventually is, omitted without loss. We can also see the emptiness of death in the fact that a death in battle can be framed in several different ways. When A kills B and the verb kill is alume, then A ennobles B. When, on the other hand, A kills B and the verb is kteno, then B is not the function of our attention at all. The point is that A is blameworthy. Or, yet again, when B dies in battle and the verb is thnesko, his death may be so vivid as to escape the bounds of time, or it may be logically subordinated to the greatness of his deeds. Either way, the reader sees only his efforts, and no gods or enemies are even mentioned. And yet all of these are the same death. Leonidas takes the emptiness of death as a cue to reframe it completely with each new narrative, giving each character a death that matches the circumstances in which the death happened. For Leonidas, no two deaths are the same. Callimachus, on the other hand, finds the void of meaning in death profoundly disturbing. It is best to call it by the name of something we understand. Yes, death happens, but let us not say so. A double dose of sleep will get us through the night. Thank you.
Well, very many thanks indeed to Michael for a third tremendous paper. It managed to illuminate a huge number of specific poems, at the same time weaving them into a marvelous literary history. And again, like Egbert's paper, it defamiliarized words and tenses and so forth that we might just sort of take for granted when reading these sepulchral poems. So we have a tremendous amount to talk about, and at the most, let's say, a quarter of an hour in which to do so. So please, pipe up with your questions, raise your hands, please.
Well, the question goes to Mr. Tuller. At least, congratulations for the presentation. I want to ask, okay, we've already seen the epigram of Perseus. We saw it today in your presentation. Also, we've already seen the epigram of Asclepiades from Palatine Anthology 711. And there's an anonymous epigram from FGE 38. In those three epigrams, there is the word for the death age is declared extra long in the elegiac pentameter, okay? It's expanding, okay? Is it just a shock, or is the intentio autoris to form a sophisticated metrical trick about a mors matura? Thank you.
I didn't get the last part. A metrical trick about what?
Do these epigrammatists want to make a sophisticated metrical trick? Because all these words are extra long. For example, there is tesseradaketin, or eneketaketeus, or eneketaketeus again for irena. So is this a sophisticated metrical trick so as to declare the mors matura and do a dramatic surprise or something?
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've certainly been thinking about that a lot, specifically in the context of the Perses poem, with that word taking up the entirety of the first half of the pentameter. I mean, to me, I don't know whether I would call it a metrical trick or something at that particular point, but it certainly is. It's interesting to me, that particular word is consonant with the general tendency of the poem to ennoble something you wouldn't expect to be ennobled, right? Yeah. So this is a 14-year-old girl, and we're talking about her from the very first word as if she's Hector. And so, to then give her, a very long word, which means something very small, that she's only 14.
Yeah,
I think is very similar to the rest of the things going on in the poem.
that one, but again, okay, some would say that's electio difficilior to put in a verse, okay? And of course in elegiac pentameter, which is really short. But for instance, in the epigram of Scolpiades, Palatine Anthology, Book 7, Epigram 11, says, Osan Parthenikas and Keteus. Okay? There can be, it misses and form a hyperbaton. Okay? So let's say it's not that electio difficilior. It can break. So I think it indicates to Morse Matura for the shock, for a dramatic shock.
I think that's right. I mean, certainly, whenever ages are mentioned, ages are mentioned pretty often in sepulchral epigram, but it's almost always when they're very small or very large. And so certainly, I think shock and the placement of the word, like you're saying in the line, it does that as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Next question. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the very rich material of all three of you. I'm full of questions and remarks, but I would like to, Egbert, it's always very good to hear your structure somehow method. In respect of what you said for 9 and 10 and the importance of the commissioner and not of the deceased, could I add that when we're speaking about children in ancient world, because they are children, the deaf people here, it is absolutely, logical that there are always the parents who are the first to do the bearing, and also children are no-existent creatures, especially in archaic times. So perhaps this is also a point that would help your idea about the commissioner. And this is the one I would like to point. And the second for this Timarete epigram, which is very important in 11, I will also notice that the lady is now the commissioner, and it is very important, according to your linguistic approach, that she doesn't speak in propria persona because she is a woman. And this is why the whole trick that the monument speaks on behalf of her. It's not a male who does the offering. It's a woman, and the woman has no voice in that particular, archaic, so to say, times. So you have perhaps to combine it with later female voices. Am I right on that?
Well, I don't think that men speak either as commissioners. I think the third person is the standard. I think I'm aware of only one archaic monument where this is the one from Rhodos, in which the case, what's the name of the man? I mean, I have a stase, I have set it up so that I would have kleos, and so, I mean, I think people mostly think that this is because the man had already created his own grave while he was still alive. But so I'm not sure the gender issue is important, because I think the third person is really crucial.
Thank you for that.
I'd also like to think that is why Thucydides' work begins with Sine Grap Sen. It's the same principle, because it is also more timeless. I mean, because the whole point is that the temporal reference remains the same no matter when the reading takes place. Whereas, of course, with a first person, I have done this, then what happens? I mean, you read it, if you do, and then you sort of reenact. So what would it mean? I have hereby created or set up the grave of my son. Would that be some kind of performative speech act that, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the point is we don't see it.
Thank you very much for that. I'm now clear about what you mean. Okay. And a second observation to Dawn. You had this great material with the graves and all, but I wonder why you missed the tomb of Hector in the end, in the very, very last lines of the Iliad.
Just because the particular words don't show up, it's not that I didn't want to deal with them. Yeah, it's just not the particular words. That's all.
Ewan, I think you had a question, or at least.
I had a small point for Egbert, and I wondered whether in the longer Theognis poem 237 to 254, which is your number 13, where I'm sure you're right about the generic mixing of sepulchral epigraphic motifs and elegy, but in 251, the second line on page 4, it does seem to me that oide there is bringing in epic commemoration via a reference to oidemos in Iliad 6. Would you agree, or do you think that's simply the idea of the symposium?
No, I would agree, of course. Also because this modeling of itself, if that is what happens, this modeling of the poetry on the basis of epigram would, of course, not exclude at all that the poetry wants to construe itself as superior song. And I think there is this symbiosis. And also, of course, the references to the death of Achilles in Iliad, Odyssey 24, and so on. But yeah, you're right.
Another question, please. Keep going. Lucas.
I don't have a question. I have a very small response to Don's a wonderful insight that the Iliad and the Odyssey will be the epigram on Achilles' tomb. And I wonder, if another reason is that there is the old tradition that Achilles does not have a tomb because, after all, Thetis is taking him to the Isles of the Blessed. So I wonder if, this takes that other tradition into account.
I haven't, mostly because I'm interested in the rhetoric of the tomb within the epics. So in as much as that's the case, I haven't. But it is interesting from the larger argument. I definitely will think about it more. Yeah.
Please, Catherine.
Michael, just on your last poem and your comment about the child and the deep sleep on the mother's knees, it seems to me that because of the present tense there, the continuing sleep on the mother's knees, which can't be the case if it's real sleep on the real mother and the child is in the tomb, that perhaps this is a signal that there's represented on the stele the child in the mother's lap.
Thanks. Yeah, that really makes sense. Yeah, and certainly, as you've heard, I have my own sort of ideas about the present tense with Snesko, but I think here you're right with Eke, and that's what it have to be.
Thank you, all three. I'll echo what others have said, but a question for Egbert. I just wondered if there might be an unspoken part of your talk that you didn't have time for, because when you're talking about commissioners and sphragidas and tenses of verbs, I'm very much interested in signatures, artist signatures on these things, particularly when the signatures are run into the epitaph, like Phaidimos Sophos. Have you thought about that?
Well, there are a number of very interesting cases in which the name of the sculpture has been added to the monument outside of the metrical structure, and also in the imperfect, as something that is separated from the fundamental act of stanai or epitainai, And I find that significant because the actual making of the work is then backgrounded. It's something that someone did in the past. Although, I mean, there are exceptions to that rule, if it's a rule, because there are also some inscriptions where you do have employees. But so it's a matter of aspect, so to speak. You can choose, because of course the actual making of the sculpture would obviously be leading into the present in the same way that the act of the one giving the order to do this would.
A few at once, but two go first.
Yeah, I have a question for Mike. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the paper, despite the topic. I mean, it can be said, obviously, that TNESCO will apply to all of us at some point, but Olimi will not. So Olimi seems to be a very special work, not only in terms of destroying or losing, but in terms of it specifies a certain kind of premature and violent death, both at the same time. And is frequently used in the Iliad. And then also in the Odyssey, you can lose Nostos or Klaus. So it seems to me to be a very epic word, which is then very appropriate for the earliest epigrams, which only ever commemorate people who are auroi and have died violently in combat or at sea. So I think that Olimi, in this sense, is very appropriately used in the early epigram to denote a certain type of death. And if losing is also part of it, then you lose something that belongs to you. And this is hebe and life. So you can't say that someone who is 90-year-old was destroyed. In that sense. So it seems to me that it must be also epic, but it also connotes a certain type of very heroic dying.
That's certainly right. Yeah, I mean, it's Olumir. I tried to bring this out some, but I think I may have brought it out only in certain kinds, in the transitive use. But you're right. In all cases, Olumir is a special kind of death, whether literally or, I think in some cases metaphorically. I mean, we just saw in one of our earlier talks where Callimachus was talking about how he lost a friend with Olumir. Now that's not the destroy use, obviously, but still, Callimachus he's not talking about a literal death in battle this time, but he's bringing that same sort of idea to it.
Later
Right, exactly.
And perhaps our last question.
Right. Well, it's basically just picking up on what Joe Day was saying about this Tragis and archaic epigram. In fact, we don't have any signatures of poets which we can securely identify as such until a poem for Arbinas, where a poet called Symmachus is actually signing the stone. And signatures of poets themselves are extremely rare throughout the history of the inscriptional genre. So it might be worth thinking about how do we go about putting author and commissioner in the same sentences equal to each other. I think that there is something to be said about conceptualization of the commissioner as the author, but we should keep the real author then really apart from that, I guess. In cases such as 9, where we have the epigrams which do not mention names of the deceased, on stones themselves, quite often we find the names also painted on the stelae or inscribed outside the meter, which is, so if we speak about the world of the epigram, we can, of course, make the case that you are making, Egbert, and say that the name is not in the epigram, but in the historical reality of the reader, it would be very, very visible, almost always. And Mike, because you asked about the way of death, I think that miaine is sort of indicative in the last poem on your handout. It did not pollute the water, which means that the child did not die in the water itself. Had it died in the water, the well would have been unusable.
Right. Well, okay. Right. I mean, so he certainly didn't die in the water. I'm not going to argue that. The question is, did he then die on his mother's lap, or is he okay? Is he just asleep?
I think the fact that they are talking about pollution is already indicative of death.
Oh, that a death has
Yes,
definitely occurred.
Yes. You can't pollute something in the water unless you die. I mean, you can, but it would involve other things, and you should be an adult and not a child.
Okay.
Well done, dauntless listeners. Before we rush to our lunch, let's thank again our 3 heroic speakers.